This program might contain strong language. If you think you may be offended, switch off now.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Watch Mojo and the Inside podcast. We started off this show earlier this year, going through 20 episodes talking about YouTube's 20 years as a platform in relation to WatchMojo's also 20 years as a company. And after that, we've kind of branched off into different themes each week. We've covered capitalism, censorship, America, and we're kind of on a local stretch now, where last week we talked about the Montreal Canadiens. This week, we're talking about the Montreal Expos on the heels of a Netflix documentary that just came out called Who Killed the Montreal Expos? So I am Rob, your host. With me is Ashkan Carbis-Fouchan, our CEO and co-founder. How's it going, Ash? And how did you like that documentary?
First of all, it's going really well. I really liked it. You know, having produced a documentary, I watched it through the lens of storytelling and just producing content and, you know, programming, but also obviously as a diehard Expos fan and Montrealer, I liked it. The doc was produced by Jean-François Poisson. You know, it's always hard when you try to jam a lot of information in like 90 minutes. You know, that's why when you think of like content on streaming platforms, you know, a feature film, it's usually they take one little scene or one little moment in somebody's life and they do a movie around that. Series, you could go deeper. So this was like a one-off. You know, if had it been a series, which I don't think necessarily there would have been demand for it. I think they would have gone a bit more granular, but I thought it was fine. It was good. Surprisingly, I wasn't like angry or depressed. Obviously, a lot of nostalgia. It took me through a lot of different periods of my life, as I'm sure most Montrealers and, you know, baseball fans. I thought it was fine. You know, throughout the story, you heard a lot of like X blaming Y and then Y blaming Z. And ultimately, I want to play a first clip, which is kind of like, I mean, we're not giving anything away. We'll start off with a clip, and then that's kind of the inspiration why I wanted to do today's show the way that we're doing it. So,
pour moi, la mort des expos, c'est une responsabilité qui est partagée. Il y a eu les actionnaires locaux qui ont clairement manqué de vision. Claude Brochu n'a pas été capable d'amener des gens dans le stade alors que c'était sa mission comme président de l'équipe. Évidemment aussi, Loria et David Samson, ils sont responsables en grande partie du départ des Expos. Ils avaient l'occasion de sauver le club.
Everybody wants there to be this moment where all of a sudden the light goes on and everyone says, ah, that's when you tanked the Expos and you did this crazy Machiavellian plot to have the Expos disappear and move to Washington. It just happened. The reason cities lose teams is not one thing, it's not one moment. And I blame myself, I think, in the proper percentage, and I absolutely will always understand the vitriol that's associated with my role in what became the death of the Expos.
Mais ce qui a vraiment tué les Expos, c'est beaucoup plus simple que ça. Ce qui a tué les Expos, c'est l'argent.
Yeah.
So that was the moment when I kind of had a bit of a epiphany, the eureka moment, when I said, okay, if we're going to cover this, and we had mentioned it like a few weeks ago when I heard about the documentary, I was like, okay, I know how to cover it. So they enumerate a number of belligerents and possible culprits. And I do think it's a bit of a cop-out because, you know, money is a means to an end. I could take money and build a hospital, or I could take money and go buy a weapon and shoot a kid in the head, you know? So I think what I want to do in today's show is actually go through the different people and players and parties and enumerate them from least to blame to probably most to blame. And just also, if I may, just because of my history and whatever, like put a little bit of context to not defend or blame anybody. But I did feel, and again, just because it's limited to a 90-minute thing, I felt like it was very, not in a bad way, superficial. I mean, à la surface. Like it was just, they would touch on things. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And as I said, I mean, like the first time I went to a game, 1987, I was 9. I was really a hardcore hockey fan. I had some friends who were baseball fans. I thought the sport was pretty boring. Obviously, I played. I don't know about you. I don't know if you were.
I did play. Yeah.
Oh, you
I
did
played
play?
when I was a kid. Yeah.
What was your position?
I was a pitcher primarily.
Okay, cool.
And when I wasn't pitching, I would play like shortstop or second base.
All right. Were you a good hitter as well?
I was a pretty good hitter.
You're a modern day or an old school Shohei Ohtani, basically.
Your words, not mine. Although I know I did tell you that earlier. But
that part you don't have to say. No, so I was really into hockey to watch, and I would play soccer, and I would play baseball, but it really was, like many others, that magical 1994 run, which we'll talk about later. And then, of course, some of you have heard it, so we'll talk a little bit. In 2003, when I was at Ashkan as a executive, but also like a columnist, I basically proposed to the radio station that had the rights to the matches, to the games, to do like a sports business show, because it was a sports network and like my background being business. So I was actually covering sports business before like the Darren Rovels and all these guys who now have built like their brand around that. And then I also, obviously, the 2003 Expos, actually until the last weekend, were in it.
Mhm.
So covered the Expos quite a bit. And in 2003 and 2004, I was really, really, really contacting everybody and anybody, turning over every stone, trying to get wealthy individuals, entrepreneurs, business people, corporations to take a look. A bit naive, because I also didn't have the full background. And, to be honest, that is one of the reasons why I actually have alluded to, I was an intrapreneur. I didn't want to be an entrepreneur. But that was the reason I started WatchMojo, like whether figuratively or literally to bring back the Expos. That's when I had like the moment that I said, you know what, in life, if you want to have any impact, you need to be able to make the decisions yourself. You could lobby, you could convince people, you could argue, debate, but in the end, you got to put yourself in a position. And like, I'm Ashkan Carbis-Fruchan, I'm not Ashton Bronfman, I'm not Jacob Desmarais, I'm just a nobody, right? So that was really like, if I've alluded to it, that was basically how I became an entrepreneur. It was just like, I wanted to bring back the Expos.
Well, maybe it's not too late. Well,
we're going to talk about it at the end of the show. Yeah.
I agree that the documentary really glossed over a lot of things. It could have been a mini series, or at least like a multiple part film. And I actually have a book right here called Ecstasy to Agony, about the 1994 Expos and how everything fell apart for them. So like, there's enough content just on that season to like fill a book, and it was pretty much glossed over in the movie. But
did you? I forgot. I should know how old you are. Were you around the 94 Magical Run? Or did you go to?
I was 4 years old in the 94 Magical Run. The team left when I was 14, and that's one thing that I wanted to bring up, because obviously I was too young to kind of appreciate things from the same vantage point that you had at the time. But just as a fan, and I know that they framed the Expos as very much a family affair in the film, which I liked, because the team was referred to as Nos Amours, our beloved. It was a very family feeling when you were at Expos games, and unfortunately, the only experience that I got to go see them was towards the end of their lifespan. But it was very important to me, because those were some of the last nice memories that I had with my dad, who passed away at the end of 2002. Baseball was a way that we really connected, and we played together, and he brought me to those Expos games. So even though it was kind of like the writing was on the wall already when we went to go see them, it was still an important memory for me. And so I really hold on to that. And there's nothing that I would love more than to see them come back, honestly.
I did not know that. So sorry to hear that. But no, I mean, look, the Expos, I say as you grow older, like really all you have are your memories sometimes. And whether it's sports or music, I mean, it's not the first time I hear of a bond between father and son. So I didn't know that. Okay. So we could jump in. So when I was watching the documentary, I was basically just writing down everybody, every party, every person mentioned. And so I'm actually going to start like with number 14, let's say, like business, what I call like the gravity of economics, the gravity of finance. And I don't want to lie, I personally found, so there's a graph, if Yvonne, you want to load it up, that just shows how, the different sports leagues generate revenue, their sources of revenue. So undoubtedly, I mean, you had started the era of free agency, and you had these superstar agents like Lee Steinberg and others who were just signing these insane deals for their athlete clients. And so you could point to money or greed, but it's like in this show we talk about sins and virtues, right? So it's like when I was watching this, I was like, greed is omnipresent. So why was it? What was it about the Expos and what was it about Montreal where fear ultimately overtook? This actually is a snapshot of the currency between U.S. and Canadian.
Yeah.
And talk about bad timing. We'll come back later to the currency, but I just want to point that in 2003 and 4, we basically had the strongest USD vis-a-vis the Canadian currency. So the Expos, even though in a decade earlier, 94 had like the best record in all of baseball, they were even ahead of the mighty Yankees. It was just like a perfect storm, right? So to me, I think money is undoubtedly an easy conclusion. And when I hear that gentleman in the documentary say it, you can't dispute it. But I think what I want to do in the next entries is explain, well, why is it that fear overtook greed? Because a lot of people, when you think of money, they get this kind, as they say, fear is temporary, but greed is permanent. So why?
Right.
So let's start with number 13. So there's a clip there that I'd love for you to play, and then we'll come back to it.
Here is Jeffrey Loria. No.
People thought that Jeffrey Loria would come in and all of a sudden the team would be saved, everything would be great. But I don't think they were fully aware of how toxic it was in Montreal long before we even got there.
Programme baseball lineup, programme de la journée, great programme.
Combien est-ce que ça a coûté la création de l'équipe des Expos à Montréal?
C'est une somme très grande, mais c'est le baseball majeur, c'est une affaire grande. C'est comme on dit, big business.
Le propriétaire original des Expos, il s'appelle Charles Bronfman.
So the way that the documentary is edited, and that's part of what we're breaking down, we're kind of like reviewing it. When Dave Sampson, and we'll explain who Dave Sampson is, but that youngish looking gentleman goes, it was very toxic. And then they cut to Charles Bronfman. I thought that there were, Sampson was referring more to just the previous immediate, history before that.
Right.
Referring to like the consortium of owners. But when I saw the director, Jean-François Poisson, cut to the Bronfmans, the insinuation is the toxicity starts off with them. So I just want to explain a little bit, who the Bronfmans were. So Sam Bronfman, beginning of the 20th century, was like your hustler entrepreneur, like there was prohibition in the US. And he basically recognized that he could, take alcohol from Canada, put it on little boats, cross across the rivers and the lakes that separate the fine countries of Canada and the US. And he was a bootlegger. And, when Honoré de Balzac goes, behind every fortune, there's a crime, or allegedly, you could fairly say, like, was that right or wrong? It's history. Now, to the Bronfmans' credit, Sam obviously had a couple of kids, Charles, the gentleman that ended up owning the Expos, and Edgar. Eventually, Edgar took his family to New York. So that was how the Bronfman family split up into US and Canada. And Charles, to his credit, really built up Seagram, which was the alcohol company that Sam had started. And, they ended up like, it was a cash cow. It's alcohol, right? So they ended up like buying DuPont. They were just generating so much money. And in that process, Charles, so the second generation, being a Montrealer, he basically put up the expansion fee to bring baseball to Canada with the Expos.
Right.
Now, a little parentheses, and why, and by the way, if I'm including anybody on this list, it's not necessarily that I blame them. I'm just going from least likely to be blamed to most likely.
Right. Okay.
They're 13.
In typical Watch Mojo fashion.
Typical Watch Mojo fashion. So, the only thing I want to say is, people sometimes go, well, the Bronfmans started, they brought up, they sold it to Brochu and a bunch of other investors. Why didn't they step in? What's the missing context? So The third generation, there's an expression in business, from shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves. In 3 generations, first generation starts it, second generation builds it, the third generation allegedly loses it. Now, Edgar Jr., so the third generation, when he took over, he was not interested in DuPont or even alcohol. So he basically sold a lot of assets, bought Universal. That's how Seagram became an entertainment conglomerate. And then he merged it with a French-based company run by Jean-Marie Messier called Vivendi Universal, Vivendi, which became Vivendi Universal. You could criticize Edgar Jr. for that. But to be fair, the man in the arena, his vision was right. His vision of synergy made sense. It was just really premature. And what happened to the Bronfman net worth as a family, it went from, let's say, something like $10 billion to $2 billion as a result of that merger, which didn't work out. Now, Edgar Jr. went on to buy Warner, and I think his track record is fine. But to those business historians, I find anybody that blames the Bronfmans, it's lacking that context. That come 2003 and 4, if you've seen your family's net worth go down by 80, 60, 70%, sure, early on, if you tell a guy who's worth $2 billion, this team loses $20 million a year, it's a write-off. It's not a big deal.
No.
But I think in that state of shock, I don't know what the expectation was of the Bronfmans, given that they had brought the team here and they had held on to it and they covered losses, yada, yada. So when I saw the editing, I thought it was curious, but if that's the point that Poisson wanted to convey, that's my takeaway. And I thought it was a bit unfair. Now, the 12 entry, also not really to be blamed, but a common theme are, the disillusioned fans. I think it's a bit unfair to blame the fans, because by 2003 and 4, heck, by the late 90s, this was after the strike of 94. This was a decade of the Olympic Stadium, which we'll talk about, just being a horrible venue. When I went in the 80s, there was probably 35,000 people in the arena. When I would go in the 1994 magical run, I remember one game going against the Braves, and it was like 60,000 or an insane number. It was packed. And sure, it still was a toilet, a concrete toilet. But, if there's enough people in any venue, you're like, okay, this isn't so bad.
Yeah.
But, the reality is that in the 2000s and late 90s, I'd go to games. That year when I had the season ticket, sometimes we'd be there with they would announce 6,000 fans, 4,000 fans. But you looked around and you're like, there's not more than
nothing sadder than that, to see 6,000 people in the Olympic Stadium.
Yeah. So for me, I think you could surely blame the fans for many things, and they deserve some of the blame, because ultimately, if they don't show up, then, why would an owner want to have a, company that sells a product when there's no consumers? But I think, it wasn't like there was nobody there in the 80s and 90s. It was literally at the end, but it's fair. And this week when this came out, you had some people Monday morning QBing it, blaming fans or blaming others. I didn't really think the fans were there. Now we're going to get to the players and the parties that I think you could start to blame. So I bundled in number 11 the 3 levels of government.
Right.
I would say the municipal government, so Montreal, the city of Montreal, is the least to blame, because I didn't even notice, but even though it was symbolic and more of a civic commitment, the city of Montreal was actually part of that consortium. So they were there, I don't know.
Part owners themselves.
They're part of, whether they wrote a check or gave subsidies, so I put them the least to blame of the 3. The federal government, we'll talk about it a bit more. Usually, all factors being equal, I think you could say, well, why didn't they see the value of having, a new baseball stadium subsidized partly or fully in Montreal, which was still the second biggest city in the country. But there's something missing, which is just the few years before that, there was a referendum. So we'll come back to that. So I don't really think you could blame the federal government for not wanting to reward a province or state that just a few years before was trying to separate, right? The level of government that I think you can blame a little bit is the provincial. So obviously, if the province of Quebec would have said, hey, we see the benefits, whether it's tourism or just local businesses or just visibility, yada, yada, yada. So we're going to help, whether it's selling the bonds or just a subsidy I think that you could make the argument, but the reason why I put them at 11 and not 2 or 3 is, again, context. At the time that basically the premier Lucien Bouchard came out and just said, yeah, this is not happening, Quebec was undergoing a lot of budget cuts to education and health. I know my Québécois. I know what Montreal is like. If at that moment the right hand is cutting education, cutting health, not addressing infrastructure woes, some of which was because of the mismanagement of the Olympic Stadium build out, by the way. We'll get to that later. And if you said then the left hand is now going to write a check for $300 million, so a bunch of rich investors, build a stadium, there would have been riots. Like, people would have been on strike. And I do think the ethics and the optics would have looked bad. So I kind of do lay a good amount of blame on the provincial government, but I think it's extremely, extremely lacking self-awareness that at that era, you would be surprised that the government would do that.
Yeah, that sounds fair.
And I think, you could make the argument that, like, if why wouldn't they be higher then? But again, it's just the context, right? Like, even I think you should prioritize health education over.
Well, yeah, exactly. And they kind of made that pretty clear in the documentary too, focusing mostly on the provincial side of it and the reasons why there wasn't money coming from the Quebec government.
So number 10, I want to just preface this by saying, je suis un fier Québécois. I totally empathize even with, like, la souveraineté. I understand it, right? But I think it's extremely intellectually dishonest not to recognize that everything could be a pro and a con. The incredible Québécois culture, the joie de vivre, everything that makes la belle province does come with a percentage, especially of the French-speaking population, to have their own nation, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that in, like, 1994, the team is crushing it. And obviously, because of finances, the next year they ended up, like, having a fire sale, and we'll talk about that. But in 1995, Quebec had another referendum. The first one was in the 80s. And those that voted to stay in Canada won by just like a little margin. So what I think a lot of people don't realize is that the climate was so tense and toxic when the side that was federalist, that wanted to stay in Canada, voted to stay in Canada. The side that lost, that was led by Jacques Parizeau, the premier of the Parti Québécois, he came out that night. Maybe he had a glass of wine that he shouldn't have had, but he basically blamed l'argent et le vote ethnique, basically money and the ethnics. The reality is he was right. Again, if I sit here and go, oh, that's racist, shut up. It's true. But why? The origins of Quebec it was first French. The French were here before, the Brits came later, and the Spaniards went down, and the Portuguese went south, right? So Quebec has always had this French root. Now, the people that came to Quebec were more like, no disrespect, all factors being equal compared to the English, lower levels of society. They weren't necessarily bourgeois. They weren't necessarily like la noblesse. They weren't necessarily like business-minded people. The Anglos who came here from Europe were more, all factors being equal, on average, higher levels of society. Not that they were better people, but they were more wealthy and affluent who came here for business. They set up the Hudson Bay Company, the fur trade, yada, yada. So early on, Montreal was one of the first cities in North America. That's why Montreal is like a Boston. That's why Montreal has a lot of wealthy families that have centuries of, like, wealth building. But so if you think about it, and this some people may not like, but it's just, we're talking facts here, right? We're talking context. So the other thing is, it wasn't just like la vote ethnique. It wasn't those pesky Hispanics or those pesky Filipinos that, like, led to the separatists not winning. It was a jab, at least partly or fully, against the Jewish community in Montreal, a community that goes back quite a bit, a community that, like all other Jews anywhere, have faced their discrimination. The Québécois are great people. They're not racist in, like, we don't like Jews or we don't like this or that. but they really want to preserve their own
They're
culture.
protective, yeah. Of
Yeah,
their
yeah.
own culture.
They kind of like discriminate like Chris Rock evenly against anybody that poses a threat to that.
Yeah.
And I think because anti-Semitism is as old as whatever, it was a bit weird when you heard that, because it was basically, yeah, part of the reason why we didn't get our country is because of the wealthy Anglos and the Jews who are more loyal to Canada than to Quebec. So if a year later, you look at the investors that were part of this consortium, who were l'argent et les ethniques, it's weird then for in that tense moment for these parties to hug it out and be like, yeah, great, we're going to give you a check as the government to go build a stadium, and you guys, even though you may lose your investment, we're going to rescue you. Yeah. But it's also my point. Some people may not like this, and that's great. Good for you, you know, but it's also the flip side. Why would, let's say, the Bronfmans had not seen their wealth evaporate by 80%. Why would the Bronfmans or any other wealthy family or individual then, in that height of uncertainty, that's fear. Uncertainty in finance is fear versus greed, right? The more unknowns, you know, if I told you now, like a couple of years ago, if I said, yo, man, let's go invest in Russia, you'd be like, yeah, I don't think that's a good idea. You know, so whenever there's instability, there's a flight of capital to quality. So what started in 76 just accelerated. And look, j'adore le peuple québécois. I live here by choice. You know, I don't want to live anywhere else. I empathize. But the Québécois people have to understand, if there's a separation tomorrow, bye-bye Air Canada. You know, Air Canada has a headquarters here, but it's a federal corporation. They need to. So it's just, I think there's this naivete that, oh, we're going to always, every few years, threaten to separate, but there shouldn't be any consequences. It shows a lack of sophistication. Anyway, so
could I just ask a question about this? Do you think had Quebec separated from Canada in 95, how would that have affected the Expos? Would that have accelerated their demise or done anything?
Yeah. Because I think what happens in the immediate reaction after any kind of socioeconomic political shock is more uncertainty. There's no investor. There's nobody that's going to come and say, like, even the government would be like, we want to stabilize currency. Like the Quebec government was like, we'll use the Canadian dollar. Yeah, not so fast, you know? So there's, you know, again, like I'm a finance guy, so I go a bit deeper in these things, but for sure, there's no sane investor that's like, let me write a check to buy a team in a crappy stadium that has 5,000 people, right? So it would have accelerated like by leaps and bounds, like had they separated. Now, that doesn't mean that 10, 15 years later, there isn't going to be improvement, you know, but if I told you right after Yugoslavia's civil war, let's go buy the Belgrade soccer club, again, you'd think I'm crazy. Now, a smart investor buys when fear is peaked, but people are conservative. People are not, you know, entrepreneurs were crazy. Okay. So I would say that the culture, which is a great strength of Quebec, definitely did not help. It's not, I'm not talking about the French Canadians, but I'm talking specifically about the 95 referendum hangover. So that to me is number 10. Number 9, the concrete coffin, the Olympic Stadium. Now, so the Olympic Stadium was built in the 70s for the Olympics. Obviously, the Expos were playing in Jarry Park, not really suitable. This is a design of what was called Labatt Park. This is from the Guardian. So everybody knows about this amazing park that could have been built, wasn't built. I remember once going to see a condo on this lot, and I was like, this is sacred ground. I cannot buy it. My sister bought it, which disappointed me in that sense, but it's all good. It was a smart investment for her. But so this was, like many other stadiums that were built in the US, kind of putting a spotlight on the skyline. It would have been beautiful. Now, again, Montreal, we live 4 or 5 months in Arctic snow and cold. We have like 4 or 5 months of spring and fall, which are very charming, and summer's amazing. We have festivals. I do think that really the only thing that would have made a possible difference, again, maybe, could have, possibly, is a stadium. It does not address all the other factors, which I think were just still overwhelmingly creating all these headwinds. But I do think that if the only thing that ultimately would have changed the product, would have changed the perception, would have changed people's like kind of like desire and propensity to go catch a baseball game, a stadium downtown would have made the difference, because the Big O was built in the East. Like, I'm not saying the East, like the main Boulevard Saint-Laurent, a street past where the cool bars are.
It was like way out there.
Like once you get to what separates East from West, you got to keep walking some 30 blocks.
Yeah.
And this was built because they wanted the Olympic Village there, but it was a disaster. And frankly, the initial budget of the stadium was 120 million. It ended up costing 1.5 billion. If you include interest and if you include like adjusted for inflation, that's a $6 billion concrete toilet that's sitting there. So I definitely think that, the stadium was probably the only thing that, especially watching the documentary, would have made a difference. Number 8, the silent killer is the Canadian currency. So earlier, Yvonne showed a graph of where the currency was. So this is basically, if you see that peak, that's 2003. So by then, it was 1.6, Canadian dollars for each US dollar. Now, most of the revenue that sports teams get are from, like in the NFL, it's TV, that's 60%. But most other sports, the TV national deals are like 20, 30%. Most of it comes from either local TV deals or ticket, merchandise, concessions. And there you go. That's the one I wanted. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So because of baseball's reality, where 30% of the revenue comes from ticket sales, 23% comes from local, 10% comes from team sponsors, and 10% comes from concession. Obviously, me as a finance guy, like I would put this number 1. Like if I was on Bloomberg or if I was like, if this was Context TV, I would go, there was no way for anybody to overcome that. Now, one could make the argument that, well, then why Toronto? Why did Toronto survive the currency? Well, it's very simple. Yes, the currency was also a headwind for Toronto, but the sovereignty threat, which led to all these corporations, all these wealthy, les maudits d'anglais, la vote ethnique, all those people went down the 401 to Toronto. So Toronto had so many tailwinds that the currency they knew was temporary, and you still generate a lot of revenue in US because of the TV deals. But so that's the difference. Toronto, also the population, it's like Chicago, right? It's like a city the size of Houston. Toronto could support a second hockey team, but the Maple Leafs would cock block that, rightfully. Toronto does support an NBA team. It could support an NFL team, if the league wanted to come up. I don't know if in Montreal, and we could talk about this later at the end, at the conclusion, I think could support a basketball team, and that would go through Le Groupe CH, Jeff Molson, because they own the Bell Center, which is already the second most popular booked arena in North America after Madison Square Garden. But my point is, Toronto has just become this massive, North American global metropolis at the expense of Montreal. And as much as I love mon peuple québécois, guys, it's like a lever. You pull the sovereignty thread, the economy is just gonna. People
are gonna leave.
People are gonna leave, and not just people, corporations. I even did a research. I said, what are like a few possible companies that would leave if the sovereignty threat comes? And I don't think the sovereignty threat is a real threat anymore. And I'm a staunch Québécois. I think Quebec just has a better shot of being stronger inside of Canada than just being this marginal small country in North America when you have this Americanization of the world, right? But the Québécois don't see it that way. Like when they're like anti-English, let's say, their memories are of the British Empire, whereas English today is a reflection of America, and the irony is, not to get too political, Jacques Parizeau, flawlessly bilingual. Lucien Bouchard, who was the premier at the time, because Parizeau had to step down because of his comments and because they lost, perfectly bilingual. Yet a lot of the politicians play this asinine game where they try to keep the people down. Themes we've talked about on the Capitalism Show, on the Show in America. These are common things. So sovereignty, I understand, I empathize, but I cannot stress it that these were major, major killers of the Expos, even though nobody wants to admit it. And I just want to say this very respectfully. That's why I put La Culture Québécoise 10. I don't want to put it number 2 and get blasted. But if we're going to be honest, it's kind of a big deal.
Yeah. Something that wasn't really mentioned too much during the documentary, if at all, and it's kind of like on the outside, so maybe that's why, but the Toronto Blue Jays did they did not help the situation for the Expos in many ways. So like in the 90s, they blocked television rights for the Expos in Ontario and Western Canada. So we're kind of limited to Quebec and the Maritimes, which was a huge blow because, as we know, TV revenue is a big deal. And then they voted in 2002 to contract the Expos, and then ultimately in 2004 to support the move to Washington. So what's your take on Toronto's role and kind of like trying to defend their territory and not lending a hand for the only other Canadian team in the league?
So I'll answer half of that when we talk about Major League Baseball and Bud Selig, and we'll talk about Toronto. But in the context of that fits in this, remember when we talked about like the Canadians last week because it was the new season? We were talking about Quebec and the Nordique, and I said, look, I don't understand why the Montreal Canadiens would ever let that happen, even if they welcome the rivalry, because they have the whole market, right? So I don't blame the Blue Jays. Like, personally, I don't like it, but I don't blame them for saying, no, I'm sorry, you can't get Expos matches because this is Jays land, let's say. Now, that would work for Ontario. Get it? I don't think it was necessarily fair or right to say, well, somebody in Saskatoon can't watch the Expos. Like, there's a bit of nuance there. Like, it's Ontario. It's not Canada. Like, you're Toronto. You're still a city. And I understand why. This is why, by the way, I feel like there's a socio-demographic divide amongst Expos fans. I'm 47. I'm a bit too old. Like, I remember the Expos. I obviously tried to save them. I started the company to bring them back. So I don't particularly love the Jays. I don't dislike them, just to be clear. Like the Leafs until they win are not really like, we hate the Bruins. I respect the Bruins, but we have to hate the Bruins, you know? Like they won the cup, you know, they know what they're doing. The Leafs, get your house in order, buddy. But the Jays, like when they won in 95 and they won 2 after we made it in 94, like we would have made it, let's say, as the best team in baseball, 95 and 96, or was it 92 or 93? Anyway, I'm getting old now. But when the Jays won,
it was before the 90. Yeah, I think it was 92, 93.
Yeah, it was the years before. So those years, I was fine with them winning. There was no animosity. I don't root for the Jays, but I don't dislike them. It's just like it's like neutral. But I do understand younger fans who never grew up with the Expos. They should root for the Jays. I don't think that's like treason. But I do think, though, that as a business, some of the decisions the Jays made were probably reasonable, and we'll talk later on. And we could talk about the ones that were not reasonable. But I also think that the Expos had so many internal problems that, to blame the Jays is like, the Leafs blaming us for sucking since 1967. Like, get your shit in order. Yeah. Then you could come and tell us why, we're the boogeyman. But that's an interesting point that you made. And then number 7, so I call it the too many cooks in the kitchen, the ownership consortium. Yeah. So, the NFL is fascinating. Yeah. So this, by the way, I hope is not wrong, but I was researching. And I mean, sometimes Google kicks ass. Sometimes ChatGPT does a good job. So I asked ChatGPT because I was like, I don't want to just come here and criticize the business community without knowing the facts. So I was like, who were these 11 individuals in the consortium? And so, the NFL always wants one owner. They don't even want corporations as an owner because they go, corporations are fickle. But they want one wealthy owner who's made his fortune in whatever, copper, or he's killed kids or something, and he's made a fortune. They don't care. They're like, you just buy it. It's your toy. We just deal with you. That was the preference of MLB as well. But Montreal, there was nobody to kind of, we'll say, replace the Bronfmans as a succession plan. So Claude Brochu, who we'll talk about in a second, so because he gets a special entry, and to his credit, Monsieur Brochu did the interview with the documentary, and there's a few others that did. Many didn't, and I understand it's ancient history. But so Claude Brochu was a VP at Seagram. That's how he knew the Bronfmans. And he ultimately hit up like 235 investors, according to the documentary, and he ended up finding 10 more. This is a who's who. Jacques Ménard was chairman of Nesbitt Burns, which is like saying you're chairman of Morgan Stanley in the US. Charles Sirois was like a telco pioneer. So that's like Craig McCaw in America, you know, or like John Malone. Like these are big players. The Desmarais, super influential family, you know, super strong in finance. It's not a family that historically liked owning sports teams because you kind of can make your as I like to say, you can make your clients happy. You can't make all your sports fans happy. But I was surprised, if this is correct, that the Desmarais were also involved. So again, blasting, you know, the consortium and ownership business community in Montreal without knowing this is a bit unfair. Jean Coutu, a pharmacy, Saputo of the Saputo Empire. And then the others, the names you might not know, but I mean, Desjardins Group is like a big financial community. Bell Canada, you know, it's like a huge telco. Bombardier, you know, huge aerospace company. The list goes on and on, right? So the point,
and then the city of Montreal also being
the city of Montreal, exactly. So if you actually educate yourself, you're like, okay, you can't just say maudit de Ville de Montréal there. Like there was support, so it was like a perfect storm. But what I want to get at is there were basically, these owners had 76% of the company. But this is the key. They did not see this, despite being business people, well-educated lawyers, financiers, whatever. They did not see this as a like financial investment. They viewed it as a civic community, which is good and bad. And this is why I believe things should be for profit, even charities, not to print money to go blow it on hookers and cocaine, but of the discipline of like, you know, just holding yourself accountable. Mm-hmm. But because they viewed it as a civic responsibility, which is noble, when it came time to cover losses or invest, they were like, no, it's like I made a donation, you use that donation, right? Yeah. This is a critical part. So I think you could blame the consortium, but, you know, they still stepped up, but there was a lot of other factors, which we'll get into. The next one is what I call the absent allies, the overall Montreal business community. So, you know, there's a weird thing about Montreal where if you look, and this is all, I'm just speculating. If you had looked at that list and you see, for example, that Bank of Montreal or BMO Nesbitt Burns is part of the partners, the way Montreal, I mean, the world works like this, but if we're talking about a sports team and it's a civic, you know, community, and it's not like, again, I'm going with what they view, that this is not financial, you are kind of preventing Royal Bank from stepping in, you know, both in terms of BMO is still an investor, but RBC, their competitor, or TD is also going to join. That's a weird dynamic, right? But what's an even worse dynamic is if BMO and the other investors are like, shit, we're going to lose our investment. This sports club is going in the crapper. Then why would RBC come and rescue BMO's investment?
Right.
You know, or why would BMO give up an asset so that then RBC goes and makes a profit on it? This happens all the time. There are sometimes businesses, you might, let's say, read a website you like, Crapster. Crapster gets bought by a company, and then they're like, we're going to shut it down. You could go up to them and say, sell it to me. I'll do something with it. They're like, no. It's kind of like schmuck insurance, or the reverse of schmuck insurance. So what ended up happening, and I know the profiles of these people. I've met some of these people. I mean, kind of, this is my milieu, right? So they do have a very, like, it's not a extend the table kind of crowd.
It sounds like it boils down to spite in the end.
I don't want to say spite, but it's a lot of spite. It's like you could say their ego got in their way because, you know, if you think about it, these were all CEOs, chairmen of elite corporations, so top of the game for their racket, and or just very wealthy individuals. So they never looked at Claude Brochu like their peer. Claude Brochu, no disrespect, I was a VP. I have VPs that I love. But they viewed him as just like a lackey. Like, he's our employee. But because Major League wanted one person to deal with, he became what's called like the GP, the general.
He had the decision-making power.
Exactly. Even though he was not a sports guy. He wasn't a baseball guy. And also, he didn't have, like, if I'm, let's say, in a position where, as an example, let's say I have a net worth, I'm just using random numbers. Let's just use $100. I have a net worth of $100, and everybody else that's around me has net worth of like $50 to $300. We could have a conversation where I'm like, we should do this. And if they go, no, I'm like, no problem. I'll pick up the tab. give me the stupid check. I don't want your stupid credit card, you know?
Mm-hmm.
The problem was Claude Brochu couldn't be like another round of oysters. Let's get some Dom P. Let's get some more champagne. Hookers and Coke for everybody. Because he couldn't actually pick up that tab.
Right.
And the problem was the others who were all like elite corporate titans, they were like, why is this Bumbleclot the guy who's the lead? And again, when this was happening, I was too young to know it. But as I was watching this and then going back in time, I'm like, well, yeah, I totally get it. I totally get it. I live this every day. It's a dick swinging match, basically, where the victim is just a sports club and the fans, right? So
which would have been, it should have in theory been solved when Jeffrey Loria came into the picture. But anyways, we'll get into that. That's jumping the gun. But
yeah. So obviously, so the problem was that, and this is foreshadowing to appease my English teacher from high school, when the capital calls came to cover those 20 million losses per year, or if they needed money for some bill there, the roof falls apart, we have to fix it. When it came time to do a capital call, the existing owners were like, nope, we gave you like a donation. That's it, right? And I'll say this, they did not necessarily have the vision and foresight, partly because they were finance guys, partly because they were like retail CEOs. They were not technology, except for Sirois, to see where the world was going to go with the internet, to see where the world was going to go with synergies and streaming and all that. And you know, they left so much money on the table because sports franchises now are worth like billions of dollars, and they basically, you know, sold it for nothing. Yeah. So the Montreal business community, I think more so than the consortium, but again, I don't want to offend anybody. I can imagine that consortium was not going to open the doors and let their competition come in. And, you know, it's funny. We talked about the French factor. Let's give you one example of what I mean. Quebec has a lot of interesting entrepreneurs. My knock is like an outside, even though I'm fièrement Québécois and I'm entièrement Québécois, even I would say Quebec's, a lot of entrepreneurs, their ambition ends at the border. And some of it, I won't lie, is that a lot of Americans have a hard time understanding when most French Canadians, Québécois, speak English. There is a bit of an accent. Like Jacques Parizeau spoke fluent. He was a hypocrite, but a lot of his people like can't even speak English or speak poorly. So some of it is that, but it's also that you have this group of people that wants to tear apart your country if you're like a Canadian federalist. So, I mean, no disrespect to the Bronfmans. This is totally projection and conjecture. There is no scenario where the Bronfmans were going to sell the Expos to somebody like the Pelados, in my opinion. Pierre-Carl Pelado, who people don't like him sometimes because he's abrasive, they say, he's brash. But you know what? He's born on third base. He's the son of the founder, Pierre Pelado's son. Pierre Pelado was also OG entrepreneur, but a staunch separatist. So if you think of who was part of that consortium, yes, Desjardins there, and Desjardins still a local player. I don't think Pierre-Carl Pelado had any care about baseball, let's say. You can make that argument. You can make the argument that baseball, c'est un sport des Anglo-Américains. Like, you know, you can make that argument if you want. But, like, we had a pitcher, Raymond there, Claude Raymond, who was a French-Canadian. We had a number, like, there was a lot of excitement in Quebec for baseball. Yeah. But I think that's what I mean. There was no way that, like, they were going to extend the table and be like, hey, Pierre-Carl, you took your Québécois print media company, you just bought Videotron, which is a cable company. You're going to push with synergy. You get where the world is going. You're going to have the leading media company in the province. I think he would have taken a look at the Montreal Expos, even if he didn't love baseball, let's say, even if his heart was to bring back the Nordiques. I don't see how the Federalist, Anglo, money and the ethnics, we'll call them, we're going to put the Expos ahead of their ego or their nationalism.
Right.
And they were not going to be like, yo, Pierre-Carl, let's go for, you know, lunch. And you know what? Why don't you join us? So that is another caught in the crossfire reality. Now, again, this is, I'm speculating, but it just goes back that the backdrop of Quebec makes it where you have this division.
Yeah.
And so, you know, just worth pointing out. Now, moving along, clearly number 5, the catalyst of all this was the 1994 strike. There is no doubt. I was 15 in 93. I was in baseball. I would go to the stadium. 94, I went so many times. Again, it was electric. And there is no doubt in my mind that what the strike did is like it accelerated a decade's worth of
decline.
What that did was ultimately take a team here that was 74-40. This I sorted across all MLB. We were better than those maudit Braves, which I don't care anymore, but at the time hated the Braves. I mean, I like their individual players, most of them, but I hated them. The Yankees were in the AL, perennially on top. We were better than them. There's not even, the Braves were in the NL, but I don't know, it's just gonna make me cry. They were really good. Now, Pedro Martinez, whom we did not draft, we traded for Delino DeShields, was one of my favorite players. But like Larry Walker, John Wetland that we had signed, Marquise Grissom, I mean, the list goes on and on. This was a talented team, stacked, all young, very much like the Habs, by the way, now, which were young. You had them. You were going to have them for many, many years. But the strike definitely, accelerated. Now, a fair question, which I ask myself when I think about the Expos is, had the Expos won the strike, had there not been a strike and had the Expos won the World Series, would it have made a difference? Do you think it would have made a difference, by the way?
I think it would have made a difference in that there wouldn't have been the steep decline that we saw the following year with the fire sale of all of the star players. It may not have ultimately solved the problem, but there would have been a lot more runway, I think, with a World Series under their belt.
I agree, except for the term vary. I personally think it would have changed things by like a year or two. And ironically, it would have maybe even happened sooner, and I'll explain. The Habs won in 1993 the Stanley Cup. The beloved Habs, strong foundation, AAA, rating. You can't get any stronger than the Habs because there's infinite demand. The Habs could jack up prices to $5,000 for a seat. People will still go, right? 95, a mere season later, all hell broke loose. They fired the coach. They changed everything. We entered the dark ages. We're just coming out of the dark ages now. But I'm just saying a championship is great, but it does not change the macro. It does not change everything else. Like, ironically, you still would have had the health cuts, the cuts to budgets and education. The infrastructure was falling apart. So I actually think the government would have been more comfortable in saying, hey, c'est pas nous. It's not our problem to build. You guys just won. Surely there is somebody that's going to come up. Again, lacking the self-awareness that the specter of separation was the real
turnoff. Yeah.
It was the thing. So I just think it would have changed the timeline, but it could have even gone faster because then it would have been more like, well, if you win a championship, that's also when a lot of players leave anyway, right? Now, you're right that it would not have led to a fire sale. So let's talk about the architect of the decline. Number 4, Claude Brochu. So in my life, I always see the good in people. Over the years, people blame Claude Brochu. I give him a lot of credit for getting in front of the camera and talking about it. So, the problem with Brochu was really that he was doomed from the beginning because he was never seen as a peer, as an equal, for the reasons we outlined. So he was paradoxically the lead man in the eyes of the MLB, but he was a bit seen as like a doormat, like you're my Uber driver, you're my Jeeves, my butler by the group. So eventually, we've talked about the sins and, pride, ego. Eventually, the wealthy, successful owners, their hubris got the better of them, plus greed and fear and all that. Like, hey, we invested money, we might lose it. So I do think that had the Expos not had the fire sale right after in 94, like they traded Marquise Grissom, one of the Golden Glove winners. He was our center fielder. He was leadoff hitter. He was super fast, caught everything. They traded him to the Braves. Like that's like us trading away Slavkovsky to the Bruins. Like,
yeah,
it's batshit crazy. Send him to fucking Siberia there or something. Like, why are you sending him to the Braves? Anyway, they traded Wetland to the Yankees. They let Walker walk, no pun intended. So I think the fire sale, so Brochu ultimately made that decision, but it's it's very easy for some of those LPs, the limited partners, the silent partners, to sit there and go, I disagree. Unless you had your checkbook open and you were going to write a big check made out to, Marquise Grissom or Larry Walker, Claude Brochu didn't have a choice. He didn't have the money. What was he going to do? Sell organs? Like, it makes no sense, right? So, but I do think that ultimately he was the face. He was the main guy.
Yeah.
So that's why he gets number 4. And the reason ultimately why they got so little back in those trades is because they weren't planning on signing new players. That's kind of was the writing on the wall. And that's the tell. At the time, it wasn't obvious. You kind of held out hope that, okay, we'll keep Pedro Martinez, who was a gunslinger. We'll keep Vladimir Guerrero, who came later, by the way, but Vladimir Guerrero was drafted and came a couple of years later. But it wasn't like they were getting any veterans back who were in ascendancy of their career.
They also had a long history of making questionable or bad trade decisions. Like they had Randy Johnson. They drafted Randy Johnson and traded him for nothing, and they became a all-time Hall of Famer.
So if you're going to go like inside the Expos, they got Mark Langston, who at the time was like an ace. I think he was with the Angels. He was this like at the time elite left-handed pitcher, and the Expos were in a pennant run. It was like the late 80s. So as much as Randy Johnson was this freak of nature, and people said, okay, he's either going to totally flop or be a dominant, like it was very binary with him. When we got Mark Langston, I was like 8 or 9 or 10, but I understood we got one of the best pitchers. So you have to give something to get something back. It's like Islanders fans are having a hard-on over Emil Heinemann, who we all love, but we got Noah Dobson that has totally stabilized the defensive core. Now we're talking about hockey, right? So I think that's like fans acting a bit stupid. They did some bad trades, but if you're going to be intellectually honest, the Expos always had really good, to the credit of Charles Bronfman originally, who picked the right execs and the right GMs, Dave Dombrowski he went on to the Red Sox. He went on and with the Marlins as well and won a lot. So we actually had good executives. We had a great scouts. We were, not hard, be like, hey, Joe, do you want to go live in Dominican Republic and hang out with the ladies and ask them where the best players are? That's why we got Vladdy and we got a lot of great players. So I think, again, it was so many things at once and not just money. It was actually the context background. Anyway, so number 3, people are now wondering. They're looking at the math. They're like, they can imagine who's left, but they're like, why is it 3 and not 2? So you can actually interchange 3 and 2. I think you can make the case. To me, number 3 is the enablers, Bud Selig and Major League Baseball. So Bud Selig was the owner of the Milwaukee Brewers. And then when he became commissioner, he put the Brewers in a trust. But he was controlling it. It's like if Donald Trump puts Trump Towers in a trust, okay, buddy, you're deciding which carat gold toilets to put in the, there's no doubt about it. But so for decades, and this actually I was at the hockey game with my good friend Phil, who was one of the big Expos fans, and he was, because I was asking him, I'm like, we're going to talk about this. Is there anything, that you want to tell me about the Expos on this theme? And he brought this up. He's like, for a long time, Selig really, really wanted to move the Brewers into the National League, and the AL and NL had 16 and 14, so that it was somewhat not even vis-a-vis
even numbers,
even internally. And basically, it's not so much that like Selig killed the Expos for the Brewers, but I think the combination of we don't necessarily do I have an incentive if the Expos die? Yeah, sure. The same way that you brought it up, the Jays, let's bring it up.
Yeah.
The Jays benefit by being Canada's team. The same way that the Groupe CH benefits if they're the only team in Quebec. You get the whole market for TV. Sure, some kids are going to buy Nordiques jerseys. Freaking Colorado and Carolina Hurricanes with this cultural appropriation. They're using jerseys of the Whalers. I'm like, you're just twisting the knife. Anyway, that was a bit of a sidetrack. But what I'm getting at is, yes, I think there is an inherent benefit greed where, and you could argue wrath, where you're like, hey, if the Nordiques die, okay, not bad for Montreal.
Yeah.
And if you're Toronto, okay, if the Expos are not there, we get 100% of the pie. We also are not competing with ultimately Rogers and Bell, these telcos, these big companies, they usually sponsor both teams or, sometimes invest in both teams, but you're competing for capital, right? You're competing for attention. And I think with Bud Selig and ESPN, by the way, and like everything, like broadcasters and all, like they never looked at Montreal like as a good thing after the nostalgia, because it was like weaker currency. It's not America. Like if you're ESPN, you don't care about your ratings in Montreal.
Yeah. Well, how many English people are watching in
Yeah.
Quebec? And yeah.
So there definitely are high, because I do think that as a league, you have a bit of a responsibility to create a healthy ecosystem. And don't forget that in the end, when the Expos were like in their coma phase, the league owned them. So they could decide to contract. And yeah, they're bastard Jays in this context, voted for contraction. So they are up there. Now, I put Bud Selig and MLB at 3, but frankly, on another day, I would have put them at 2. I understand the vitriol, to quote Dave Sampson. And, Dave Sampson mentions about the fans' viewpoint of Jeffrey Loria and Dave Sampson. So let's play a clip for a few seconds. We'll come back, and then we're almost done the list, and we can wrap up. So yeah, let's play that last clip with the lawsuit.
Myself, of course they're doing this. This is the final part of them doing mea culpa. The final part of them saying it wasn't me. That case lasted a long time. They spent millions of dollars of their own money. They wouldn't put it into the team, but they would put it into the lawsuit to make sure they could blame someone for the team going south.
Judgment come down by 3 arbitrators in New York. The main conclusion was we, Quebecing, should have protected ourselves. He was never going ahead with the new stadium. He wanted to get his 2/3, that we're wise enough businessmen to have realized that.
They lost every last part of that lawsuit. Every motion, every count, every allegation. They were wrong on every part of it, and it's in the public record.
So that's a fascinating piece. And I commend that gentleman, Mr. Rottenberg, for, again, going in front of the camera. He was one of them. He didn't have to do this.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure he wanted to get, off his chest. But so this is critical, right? Because you could argue that business is about opportunity. Buy low, sell high. Jeffrey Loria was like an art dealer in New York. Dave Sampson was like a finance guy who was his stepson. What is their responsibility to Montreal? None. Like I wish they had a responsibility, but we talk about stakeholder management. Montreal in the community was like number 8, so they probably came in. They were like, I've been wanting to get into baseball. It's hard to get a franchise through expansion. Let's buy the Expos. We'll give it now. If they had malicious intent from the onset, possibly. If it would have done well, if the fans would have shown up. Now, when you look at the documentary, and it jogged my memory, it's true, there was no TV deal. How the hell do you expect to
Yeah.
I remember like in that last weekend in 2004 against the Marlins, they were in the pennant race. We were driving around finding a bar to play it. And I remember Brad Wilkerson, whose bobblehead is there. He scored a home run, and I was like pumping my fist out of my sunroof. But I was like, what is this shit town? What is wrong with these people that you have the baseball team, you can't watch it in your city. Anyway, we'll get there in a second. So what I'm getting at is they didn't cause this disease. They definitely delivered the euthanasia, but I alluded to capital call. So in business and finance and investments, new money means new terms. So yeah, Jeffrey Loria put in a clause that said if there's a capital call, if you don't meet your pro rata share, so if you own 2% and we need $1 million and you don't put 2% of $1 million, I could put in the money and buy you out.
Which he did.
Which he did. I think he was shrewd. He may have had bad intentions. I commend the gentleman that said, yeah, us Quebec Inc., basically we got outsmarted. He may be saying it a bit ironically. And I don't criticize those leaders, because from the get-go, it was a different era. To them, it was like a civic donation. It wasn't like a business decision, so to speak.
Yeah.
But I think while they definitely are number 2 or number 3, I don't think it would have made a difference, is what I'm getting at. I think if somebody else would have come, they might have been more sheep than wolf, maybe more Machiavellian inside and pretend to be the good guy, and still they would have done the same thing. It would not have been as ruthless, it would not have been as pulling a heart out, but maybe that guy would have cried. Like when I love Wayne Gretzky. When Wayne Gretzky got traded from the Oilers to the Kings, he cried at the press conference in Edmonton, which is a normal. You could say he was faking it. No, it's a normal.
A human
he
reaction.
In LA, he was smiling. It's human emotions.
Yeah.
So I think, sure, for the role that they played, Loria, sure, people go, he's a snake, but in the end,
when I was growing up, he was the villain. Like he was who everybody loved to blame him, and that's what I was. The impression that I had when I was, teenager was that Jeffrey Loria killed the Expos. So
yeah, and I mean, it was also weird when then they ended up getting the Marlins and they won the World Series.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sure a lot of Expos fans called the FBI and said Al Qaeda's hub in America is like the stadium in Miami there, but it is what it is. Okay, so that's number 2. So who's number 1? So when I was watching this, I had a lot of flashbacks to sending faxes to investors, emailing, calling, okay. So to me, the number 1 is the Montreal Canadian as well, not Montreal Canadians, the Montreal mainly, but also Canadian mindset and mentality. We've talked about this. Success, ambition, including money, which the gentleman in the opening blamed. There is just this negative, small-mindedness, defeatist element. It's like, apart from hockey, there's a lack of confidence. And this is something that, to me, as I was watching this, I totally understood. I know Drake is from Toronto. Drake had to go into the US to become successful, and then he became Toronto's boy.
Yeah.
WatchMojo went out and built a global business, and then La Caisse de Dépôt called me back 15 years later. And I like La Caisse. They're like a CalPERS. They're like a huge investor here. So Quebecois people have a hard-on for foreigners. Jeffrey Loria was a New Yorker. So the second that this guy comes, let's say I'm in door 1, Ashkan Karbis-Fruchen, studied here, lived in every neighborhood here, flawlessly bilingual. Let's say I made a fortune in business, or I inherited. I didn't know my uncle was the Sheikh of Brunei, let's say. I show up, but and I could be Jean Tremblay, because I'm a local, they don't take you seriously. Or they don't extend the table because of some bullshit political thing, or your grandpa did this to my grandma and all this, even though they'll all go and have scotch and cigars and laugh at the pores and you know what I mean? Like, that is true, but they will never extend the table, right? So to me, it's this mentality that is so small, so regional, so villageois. We're so many, I respect Alain Bouchard, who started Couche-Tard. He went out and he acquired a bunch of convenience stores in the US. I respect Guy Laliberté. He started off as a street performer in Quebec City. He went to the government, said, give me money to put up a circus that's different. And he realized, okay, Montreal's limited. Je m'en décalisse to Vegas, and he built an empire. I mean, Cirque du Soleil may be more associated with Vegas than Montreal. Those are rare in Montreal. Montreal lacks ambition. Montreal views money as a bad thing. So all these people that sit there and blame money and all this, it's because it's inherently, success is seen as a bad thing. And I have a much better network in New York than in Montreal, because in New York, people will collaborate. It's so expensive. Yes, it's competitive, but it's like that expression. If you want to go far, you go together. If you want to go fast, you go alone. Mm-hmm. Montreal, in 2023 and 24, Stephen Bronfman, who's the son of Charles, and Mitch Garber, who was a very successful Montreal-based entrepreneur, they were part of a group that wanted, again, to bring the Expos, not through expansion, but by bringing what the league did to Montreal by splitting our games with San Juan, Puerto Rico. They wanted to do with the Devil Rays. They were like, Tampa doesn't have a stadium. Give us some summer games. You keep the fall and winter games. Yep. And first of all, let's be clear. I commend them for trying. But if, I'm going to use somebody else. Dax Da Silva, famous Montreal. He's originally from Vancouver, but he built Lightspeed here. Random. Let's say he's got a net worth of $1 billion. They probably did not email him. I'm not saying he's interested in that. He supports a lot of communities that are closer to his heart, that he identifies with. But I didn't want to give myself as an example. I've met people at Claridge, Stephen Bronfman's fund. I know Mitch Garber. It's not like they would pick up the call and be like, Ash, you're a baseball fan. And it's not about me, but I'm just saying that mindset. They probably did not call Pelado. They're like, well, we're not partnering with them. So it's just this very negative, small, defeatist mindset that views success as bad. Like I spoke to a very successful, wealthy individual, also third generation of a very wealthy family, like the Bronfmans, we'll say. And I said, what about sports? And he goes, no. He goes, like, it's why would I put a bullseye on my back? He's like, you're going to come criticize me for for signing a free agent or not? So it's already a tough thing. And I just think, so to me, I would say, and it includes putting language ahead of the economy. It includes virtue, like the city that is so incompetent that they spent $6 billion for a stadium. Yeah, I wouldn't want them to build another stadium. There's no roads that work. You drive. I mean, I have like people come up from LA when they come for the just for laughs. They're like, Ash, I've been coming here for 10 years. Why is your stupid road still all under construction? So
the orange cone business is thriving here.
I think the owner of the orange cones could sign it. So all I'm getting at is, and if I were to be honest with you, in some ways that Montreal climate has improved since 2004, and in many ways it's gotten worse. So that's my rank, but
that seems like a very fair rank to me. Very interesting. And that pretty much covers all of the main players. So now my question is, 20 years later, are there any signs of potential? Is it harder now than ever before to imagine the Expos coming back, or has anything changed within Montreal, within our business community? Like, what's going on right now?
Well, yeah. So let's start. We'll try to be brief because this could be a whole hour. But if you give me 2 minutes, because I know we're at 1 hour and 11 minutes. But if you give me 2 minutes, I think the main media technology backdrop has changed. Like with the advent of streaming and all that, I think rights are worth a lot more. Two, I mean, the expansion fee for a baseball team is $2.2 billion, which is like 20 times more than the 130 million that like the Arizona Cardinals and the Devil Rays paid in 98. But it is harder. And the reason is, I don't necessarily think that, even though if MLB is interested, I don't necessarily think they view Montreal as a priority. There's probably other places that they view as a priority. I also think that, like, if you're going to be honest about it, even if somehow Mr. Steinberg, who is the owner of the Devil Rays, let's say Mr. Bronfman's like, I want to retire now. I tried it. I'm done. Let's say Mr. Garber goes, I'm out. I tried this for 10 years. I'm out. Let's say they're looking for the greater fool theory. And they're like, Ash, you're passionate about baseball. If Mr. Steinberg in Tampa calls me and goes, do you want to put up an ownership group to buy half the team and play half the games in Montreal? Let's just go. He goes, raise $1 billion. Let's say if the expansion fee is 2.2, let's just keep round numbers. He goes, give me $1 billion for half of the Devil Rays. Okay, that's $1 billion for half of the team. You still need to spend $1 billion for a stadium. You're not going to go play in an Olympic stadium. If you bring back any team and you go play in the Olympics, you might as well just shoot yourself. Like, that's foolish, right? And practically speaking, the lot that they wanted to build the stadium, that's gone. There's condos. There was another lot, as a Peel Basin, that probably they built other condos because we need more condos in the city. So there's also that. You're not going to put in blue bonnets. It's not bad for the West Island crowd, but you do need to be downtown, right? So there's that. And, I just to land on this, earlier this year, we talked about all these companies that reach out to WatchMojo because they're like, we want to be more present on YouTube. So, we've been having a lot of conversations with parties. Some of them want us to do more of the same. Some of them are very ambitious and they want us to do more. There was this one group, I won't mention who because it would be very clear, but they actually made an offer for a sports franchise this year. So as I was talking to them, I sent them a note and I was like, wow, like this takes balls, props, it's a long shot. But then I was like, okay, I won't mention the sport and all that to keep it general. But I was like, hey, is your interest in the sport? Is it in the city? And he was like, they took me through what they were thinking. And I kind of said, oh, it's funny because when I started WatchMojo, I kind of really wanted to bring back the Expos. And then I was like, well, what are your thoughts on baseball? And, this person obviously knows we're in Montreal. And if we pursue a deal with them, they want to grow, very ambitious. So we started to have this conversation, and you know, that's one reason I like them, because they really want to grow. And so he was like, okay, let's talk about this. Like next time we see each other face to face. I don't know if in my heart I would actually recommend that is the best use of their capital because of culture. And I'm not talking the French Québécois at all. I don't mean culture in that sense. When the Expos left, I used to drive around and see all the baseball diamonds one by one be converted into soccer pitches.
Mm-hmm.
I also think that at the root, the sport of Le Peuple Québécois is hockey. Pierre Carpelado has been an exemplary owner of the Montreal Alouettes, the CFL club. I don't know if the interest for baseball is there. I understand this week, I think in Canada, Netflix's this documentary was #2. That's normal. Is that like just curiosity, nostalgia, or would the fans support? So if a lot of things come together, and I'll finish here, like in 2004, when I was doing my show on the radio, it was like sports business. I remember vividly, I came up with a plan. I had a plan that was like, you get the builders, the Condorels, the whoever builds it, you know, the Lavalins, all these guys. I was like, they could come up and help build a stadium and ultimately be equity holders, and then they would get some kind of preferred shares where they get dividends to start recouping their investment, but they would remain equity holders. At any given time, there was like 20,000 listeners to that radio. It wasn't like anybody. I mean, I know people were listening, but my point is, if anybody at those companies would have said, "Okay, this guy may sound crazy, but let us steal his idea and do it," they would have made like 20 times their return. Right? They would have gone from $100 million to $2 billion in a decade, frankly.
Yeah.
But that's the problem. It's a very small elite group that ultimately does not extend the table, that thinks they have the solution, and they don't let their ego, get out of the way for other stakeholders to benefit, in this case, fans and all. So my point is, I don't know. Like, I honestly, we were talking about sports leagues, and I was like, and the NBA franchise fee is $6 billion. So I was like, I would not pay $6 billion for an NBA team. But if we're going to be fair, in Montreal, the socio-demographic makeup, think of all the immigrants, and not being racist here, it's just a fact. They're more drawn to basketball than baseball. Baseball is seen as like an American sport for old white men, whether that's fair or not, right? So when I was joking, I said, well, I definitely would not recommend a basketball team, just because if you plunk down $6 billion, you have to grow that quite a bit. But I was like, I'm not, there's no way I'm getting a hockey team in Montreal. And I don't want to own a team. A few years ago, I could have bought an Edmonton soccer team, but I was like, well, I'm not in Edmonton. If something goes wrong, I'm just going to get blamed that I'm not there to help fix it. But I was like, look, happy to talk to you. And if you're serious about the Expos, I'm like, there's a lot that has to happen. But to be honest, the first thing that has to happen is the people that were like leading the parade, it's kind of like you have to make room for the next generation. And that's the part, what I mean, the mindset and the mentality of the city. So I'll leave it at that. But I don't necessarily think that the conditions are there for the Expos to succeed, because you need the stadium. Like, even if some guy goes, here's $2 billion, let's go buy the Devil Rays, where are they playing?
The age-old dilemma that we still face here in Montreal, which we will probably until the Olympic Stadium collapses in on itself one day, because isn't it too expensive to demolish it also? Like, that's why it hasn't been removed at this point.
It's the incompetence of Montreal. Like, Montreal's the greatest city, but this guy, I don't know about this guy. Anyway,
Ash, I don't like to leave things on a sour note, but I don't see any other way to wrap this up.
No, it's not sour. Look, I think we did a top 10 moments list, and we'll leave it on a positive note.
That's
and
true.
Initially, when I read the script, like the writer had kind of like concluded with like, and then they went on to win in Washington. And I was like, I just read it like for quality control and make sure as a fan, I was like, I think it's fine to reference, and the team went on to win. But I was like, you should mention more about that. Like, that brand remains, the fan base remains, nostalgia, and life's very long. Maybe the club comes back in 50 years when Miami gets buried underwater and they need to move somewhere in a plot twist, right? But I think you get money. What I'm getting at, here's the perfect ending. The gentleman in the opening clip blamed money.
Mm-hmm.
Money is not the issue. There is more than enough money out there. The problem is everything else. To quote Wanda Sykes, not you. The problem is you, bitch. You know, like the problem is clear to everybody, and it's the mindset and the mentality of this city. But unfortunately, even if you address all that, then you need to physically build a stadium somewhere. And so that has to be addressed.
Yep, definitely valid concerns. Well, thank you for everybody for sticking around for a longer than usual episode. I don't know what we're going to be covering next week. It could be literally anything at this point, but I'm excited to see what comes of this. And yeah, until next week, thanks a lot, Ash, and everybody take care.
Go Expos, go.
Let's go Expos.
Cheers.